sound of a high-voltage electrical arc, followed by a woman's piercing scream. Flashing red and blue lights strobe across a pristine suburban home. Woman, OS. Hysterical. He tried to blow up my car. My baby could have been in there. He's a terrorist. Quick cut to a man's face, illuminated by a monitor. He watches a live security feed of the chaos outside. He slowly raises a coffee mug to his lips, a ghost of a smile playing on his face as he clicks a mouse. On screen, a data log finalizes theft report sent PDF. The first time it happened, Leo blamed himself. Maybe he'd been unclear. Maybe the unspoken rules of suburban coexistence had evolved past his understanding. He'd come home from a 12-hour shift at the data center, his mind a jumble of server migration protocols and cooling system diagnostics, to find the sleek, obnoxiously white snout of his new neighbor's Porsche Taycan parked halfway across his driveway. A thick black cable snaked from its charging port to the wall-mounted unit he'd spent $1,000 installing just 2 months ago. His charger for his car. A modest Mustang Mach-E that was, at that moment, parked on the street with a battery hovering at a stressful 19%. There was no note on his door, no text message, just a silent, humming theft in progress. Leo stood there for a long moment, the keys digging into his palm. His neighbor, a woman he'd met only once, and whose name he was already struggling to recall, Catherine, had waved at him with the kind of strained, regal pleasantry one might offer the groundskeeper. She had that sharp, blonde, Lululemon-clad look of someone who spent her days arguing with store managers and whose primary personality trait was a deep, unshakable belief in her own main character status. He let out a slow, tired breath. Be the bigger person, Leo. This was his first home, the culmination of a decade of ramen-fueled study sessions and mind-numbing entry-level IT jobs. He wanted peace. He wanted to enjoy his small patch of lawn and the quiet hum of his own appliances. He walked over, unplugged the Porsche, and carefully coiled the cable back onto the holster. He left the charging port door on her car agape, a gentle, passive-aggressive hint that the transaction had been interrupted. He then retrieved his own car from the street, plugged it in, and felt a wave of relief as the familiar green light pulsed to life. He went inside, ate a cold slice of pizza over the sink, and fell into bed, chalking it up to a bizarre one-time misunderstanding. The second time, there was no room for misunderstanding. It was a week later. Leo had a critical early morning presentation, a project review with the CTO that could greenlight the infrastructure overhaul he'd been championing for 6 months. He'd planned his evening meticulously, get home by 8, plug in the car, to ensure a full charge for the 60-mile commute, run through his slides one last time, and get a solid 7 hours of sleep. He pulled onto his street at 8:05 p.m. to see the Porsche once again occupying his charging station. This time, a hot, acidic anger flooded his chest. It wasn't just the gall of it, the sheer, breathtaking entitlement. It was the complete disregard. She hadn't just used his charger, she had unplugged his car to do it. His Mach-E sat next to the charger, its own cable lying limp on the concrete like a dead snake. A quick check of his app confirmed his battery was still at the 32% he'd left it with that morning. Not nearly enough for a round. Trip to corporate headquarters and back. The lights were on in her house. He could see her silhouette moving behind the fashionable frosted glass of her front door. The peace and quiet loving part of his brain screamed at him to just let it go, to find a public fast charger and sacrifice an hour of his evening. But the part of him that had worked for everything he owned, the part that believed in basic human decency and respect for other people's property, was already marching across the lawn. He rang the doorbell. The chime was some obnoxious multi-part melody from a classical piece he didn't recognize. After a full minute, the door swung open. Yes? Catherine, he was sure it was Catherine now, stood there, phone pressed to her ear. She wasn't wearing yoga pants this time, but a silk blouse that probably cost more than his monthly car payment. She looked at him not with recognition, but with the flat, impatient annoyance of someone swatting away a fly. "Hi," Leo began, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Catherine, right? I'm Leo from next door." She gave a curt nod, her eyes flicking down to his work-worn sneakers and then back up. "I'm on a call." She made a move to close the door. "This will just take a second," he said, planting, his foot almost unconsciously on the threshold. "You've plugged your car into my charger again. You unplugged mine to do it, and I have a really important meeting tomorrow morning. I need to charge my car." She lowered the phone slightly, a perfectly sculpted eyebrow arching in disbelief. "Oh, that." She didn't sound apologetic. She sounded bored. "I saw you were over 30%. I was practically on empty. I figured you wouldn't mind." The casual arrogance of it was stunning. "I do mind," Leo said, his voice tightening. "It's my charger, my electricity, and I need it. That's why I have it. For my car." Catherine sighed, a dramatic put-upon sound. She spoke into her phone. "Can you hold on a sec, Tiffany? My neighbor is having some sort of episode." She covered the receiver and gave Leo a look of profound condescension. "Look, I'll be done in an hour, maybe 2. My battery health settings prioritize slower charging. You can plug yours in then. It's not that complicated." "It's complicated for me," Leo countered, the blood pounding in his ears. "My meeting is at 8 a.m. I need to leave by 6:30. A couple of hours won't be enough. Can you please just move your car and let me charge mine?" For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face. Anger. It was the indignation of a queen being questioned by a peasant. "Are you actually serious right now? I am in the middle of a very important call with my event planner. You are making a scene over a few kilowatts. It's incredibly petty. This is a community. We should be helping each other out." "This isn't helping. This is you taking my property without asking." "Property?" She laughed, a short, sharp bark. "It's a plug on the side of your house. Don't be so dramatic. I'll be done when I'm done." And with that, she slammed the door in his face. Leo stood on her perfectly manicured doorstep, shaking with a rage so pure it felt like a physical force. Petty? Dramatic? He was the one being stolen from, and he was being painted as the villain. He stumbled back to his own house, his mind racing. He could call the police, but what would they do? File a report for a few dollars worth of stolen. Electricity? It would be his word against hers, and she would twist it, make him sound like a lunatic. He could call the HOA, but that would involve weeks of paperwork and hearings, all for the same result. He slumped into his office chair, the presentation slides mocking him from his monitor. His mind, trained to see systems, to find exploits, and patch vulnerabilities, started working on a different kind of problem. She saw his charger as a public utility. She saw him as a petty gatekeeper. She felt she was owed something, that the rules didn't apply to her. He couldn't stop her, physically. He couldn't reason with her, so he would have to speak a language she couldn't ignore. The language of data, the language of consequences. His charger wasn't just a plug. It was a Juicebox 40, a smart charger. It had an app. It had an API. It had firmware he could access. He had connected it to his home's Wi-Fi, integrated it with his smart home hub. He could see every watt it drew, the voltage, the amperage, the duration of every charging session. He had a complete, time-stamped log of her theft. But a log wasn't enough. A log was just data. He needed to turn that data into a weapon. A cold, precise calm washed over him, extinguishing the fire of his anger. The problem wasn't the woman. The problem was an unauthorized user accessing a secure system. And you dealt with unauthorized users by locking them out. Or, better yet, by creating a honeypot. A trap so elegant, so technically sound, that the user would ensnare themselves. He wasn't going to damage her car. He wasn't a vandal. He was a systems architect. He was going to build a better system. For the next 4 hours, Leo didn't sleep. He didn't practice his presentation. He worked. Fueled by caffeine and a righteous fury, he dove into the Charger's developer console. He wrote a script, a beautiful, vicious little piece of code. He started by whitelisting his own car's unique vehicle identification number. If his Mach-E plugged in, the Charger would function normally, but if any other vehicle connected, if Catherine's Taycan ever connected again, his script would trigger a special protocol he lovingly named Operation Entitlement. First, the protocol would instantly throttle the power output. Instead of the robust 40 amps she was used to, it would drop the charge to a pathetic 8 amps, just a little more than a standard wall outlet. It would be slow enough to be almost useless for a car as large as hers, but not so slow that the car's system would register an error. It would simply report charging, tricking her into thinking everything was fine. She would plug it in for 8 hours and be lucky to gain 50 miles of range. Second, every charging session from the unauthorized vehicle would be meticulously logged in a separate encrypted file. Not just the kilowatts used, but a unique hardware ID broadcast by the car's onboard charging unit, an undeniable digital fingerprint. Third, and this was the masterpiece, the script would interface with his. The sound that woke Leo on Saturday morning wasn't his alarm, but the percussive slam of a car door, followed by a string of curses that cut through the suburban quiet with surgical precision. He smiled, rolled over, and checked his phone. 7:15 a.m., right on schedule. He'd received another notification an hour earlier. Operation Entitlement. Session terminated. Unauthorized vehicle disconnected. Total energy delivered. A measly 14 kilowatt-hours over 9 hours, enough to add about 45 miles of range to her massive battery. Just enough to be infuriatingly useless. He padded over to the window that overlooked his driveway, coffee mug in hand. The scene below was pure theater. Catherine, dressed in what appeared to be designer tennis whites, was staring at her car's dashboard with a look of apoplectic rage. She unplugged the charging cable from her Porsche and then plugged it back in, her movements sharp and violent. She peered at the small indicator light on the port, then back at her dashboard. Nothing was different. She kicked the front tire of her own $100,000 car, a move of such impotent fury that Leo almost laughed out loud. He knew what would happen next. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He had about 30 seconds. He'd just settled into his office chair when the doorbell rang, not with its usual melodic chime, but with a series of frantic, percussive jabs. He let it go on for another 10 seconds before rising to answer. He opened the door to find Catherine on his porch, her face a blotchy mask of indignation. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes. "Your charger is broken," she snapped, forgoing any greeting. She held up her car key as if it were evidence in a murder trial. "It was plugged in all night and my car is barely charged. You've completely ruined our trip. We were supposed to be in the Hamptons by noon." Leo feigned a look of mild concern. "Oh, that's strange," he said, his voice a carefully crafted instrument of calm reason. "It worked perfectly for me the other day. Are you sure you seated the connector properly? Sometimes if it's not clicked in all the way, it won't initiate a full-speed session." "I know how to plug in a car," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I plugged it in. The light came on. And then this morning, nothing. It's your cheap, faulty equipment. It probably damaged my battery." "I can assure you the equipment isn't cheap," Leo said, a hint of steel entering his tone. He leaned against the doorframe. "It has surge protection ground fault circuit interrupters. It's a very safe unit. If there was any kind of electrical fault, it would have shut down immediately to protect the vehicle. It's more likely a compatibility issue." "A what?" she spat, clearly not expecting a technical discussion. "A compatibility issue," he repeated smoothly. Sometimes a car's battery management system, the BMS, can misinterpret the handshake protocol from the charger, especially after a recent software update. It might default to a low-amperage trickle charge as a safety precaution. Did you have your Porsche serviced recently? Or did it get an over-the-air update? He was burying her in a plausible avalanche of technobabble, and he could see it was having the desired effect. Her angry certainty was being eroded by a confusion she would never admit to. "No, it's your charger," she insisted, her argument reduced to a blunt instrument. "You need to fix it, and you need to compensate me for this. We had non-refundable reservations. This is going to cost me thousands of dollars." Leo's eyebrows shot up. The sheer, unmitigated audacity was almost impressive. She had stolen his electricity, and was now demanding he pay for her vacation because the tool she used for the theft hadn't performed to her satisfaction. "Let me be very clear, Catherine," he said, his voice dropping the neighborly pretense and taking on the quiet authority of a systems administrator revoking privileges. "My charger is for my personal use. You are not authorized to use it. The fact that you chose to, without my permission, and then based your travel plans on that decision, that's not my responsibility. That's entirely on you." A flicker of panic entered her eyes, quickly replaced by a renewed wave of fury. She was a cornered animal, and she was coming out swinging. "How dare you? I saw your car was fully charged. You weren't using it. What is wrong with you people? This obsession with mine. It's a plug. I was going to pay you for the electricity, for God's sake." It was a blatant, clumsy lie, and they both knew it. "Were you?" Leo asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Because you've used it twice before that I know of, and I haven't seen $1, or a thank you, or even a simple request." "This is unbelievable," she seethed, taking a step back and pulling out her phone. "I am not going to be spoken to this way by some tech nerd. I am going to call the police. You've damaged my property and sabotaged my vacation." "Please go ahead," Leo said, gesturing with an open palm towards the street. "I would love to have a discussion with them about unauthorized use of utilities. I have detailed logs for every charging session from this address, including the exact power draw and the unique hardware ID of the vehicle connected. I'm sure they'll find it very illuminating." The mention of logs and hardware IDs seemed to land like a physical blow. The color drained from her face. She was a bully, and like all bullies, she was a coward at her core, completely unprepared for a victim who had meticulously documented her transgressions. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently for a moment. The threat had collapsed. She had no move left on the board. "You are a sick person," she finally whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "A sick, petty little man." She turned on her heel and stormed back across the lawn to her car. A moment later, her husband, a man with the weary, defeated look of someone who had long ago surrendered, came out of the house. He got in the driver's seat, and without a single glance in Leo's direction, they drove away, the Porsche moving, with the sluggishness of a beast with a nearly empty stomach. Leo closed the door, his heart hammering. It was a victory, but a hollow one. He hadn't wanted this fight. He had just wanted to be left alone. But she had forced his hand, and now a line had been crossed. For the rest of the holiday weekend, an uneasy truce settled over the two houses. He didn't see Catherine at all. He assumed they had taken their other car, some monstrous gas-guzzling SUV he'd seen in their garage on their trip. On Tuesday morning, the Porsche was back in its usual spot. Life seemed to return to normal. Leo knew it was an illusion. A person like Catherine didn't learn from a single defeat. Her ego was too vast, her sense of entitlement too deeply ingrained. She wouldn't see the confrontation as a lesson, but as a battle she had temporarily lost. She would be looking for a way to win the war. He was right. The following Friday, Leo had to go into the office for a late-night server maintenance window. It was unavoidable. a physical reboot of a critical array that couldn't be done remotely. He left the house around 9 p.m., his own car charged to a comfortable 80%. As he drove away, he glanced at his charger, the green glow of its standby light a beacon in the dark. He felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He was leaving the gate unguarded. The maintenance went smoothly. By 1 a.m., he was packing up his laptop, eager to get home. He slid into his car and was about to pull out of the deserted corporate parking lot when his phone buzzed. It was the notification. Alert. Operation Entitlement has been initiated. He swore under his breath. She had been watching, waiting for him to leave. The sheer premeditation of it was chilling. This wasn't a crime of convenience anymore. It was a deliberate act of defiance. A middle finger aimed directly at him. He pulled up the live camera feed on his phone. The image was grainy in the low light, but unmistakable. The white Porsche was parked in his driveway. The cable was connected. She was stealing from him again, right under the all-seeing eye of his security system. His first instinct was to race home, to catch her in the act, to have the confrontation he'd played out in his mind a dozen times. But he stopped himself. Anger was a poor strategist. He had the system. He had the plan. He needed to trust it. He drove home, a cold fury settling deep in his bones. As he pulled onto his street, he cut his headlights, coasting the last 100 feet in near silence. He parked across the street and 2 houses down, tucking his car into the shadow of a large oak tree. He had a perfect view. The lights were on in her house. He could imagine her inside, feeling smug, victorious, believing she'd gotten away with it, that she'd put the little tech nerd in his place. He sat in the dark, watching, his phone recording. A time lapse of her car latched onto his charger like a parasite. An hour passed. Then 2. At 3:37 a.m., her front door opened. Catherine emerged, looking around furtively before walking briskly to her car. She unplugged the charger, got in, and backed out of his driveway. She didn't park in her own. Instead, she parked on the street in front of her house. She was trying to hide the evidence, to create the illusion that the car had been there all night. It was the final piece, the proof of intent, the undeniable demonstration of a guilty mind. Leo waited until her lights were out. He drove the rest. Of the way home, parked in his own garage, and went straight to his office. On his monitor, the second evidence package was already compiled. Theft Report 2.zip. It contained the new data log, the new hardware ID capture, the new video of her plugging in the car. The body camera arrived in a discreet brown box on a Wednesday. It was smaller than Leo had anticipated, a sleek black rectangle no bigger than a stick of gum, with a lens that was a mere pinprick of mirrored glass. For an hour, he sat at his desk, turning it over and over in his hands. It felt alien, a piece of spycraft that belonged in a world far removed from his quiet suburban life. This was the Rubicon. Up until now, his actions had been defensive, contained within the digital walls of his own property. This little device would take the war to her doorstep. He spent the next 2 nights methodically testing it. He clipped it to the placket of his polo shirt, the pocket of his jacket, the strap of a messenger bag. He walked around his house, recording, then meticulously reviewed the footage. He checked for stability, for clarity of audio, for the subtlety of the placement. He needed it to be invisible. The placket of a dark-colored shirt proved to be the best option. The camera's lens blended seamlessly into the fabric's texture, looking like nothing more than a stray thread or a shadow in a buttonhole. Now he needed a pretext. Walking over and launching into an interrogation was out of the question. It had to be organic, a natural interaction that would lull her into a state of casual arrogance. He needed bait. He found it on Saturday morning. While watering a potted fern on his porch, he noticed one of Catherine's sprinkler heads had gone rogue. Instead of watering her prize-winning azaleas, it was casting a wide, wasteful arc across the concrete of his driveway. It was perfect. A legitimate, minor, neighborly complaint. An ideal Trojan horse for the conversation he needed to have. He waited until he saw her outside, retrieving a package from her porch. This was it. His heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He took a deep breath, activated the camera with a discreet click he'd practiced 100 times, and walked out his front door. "Catherine! Hey, got a second?" he called out, injecting a forced but plausible friendliness into his voice. She turned, her expression immediately souring as she saw him. Her body language screamed hostility. She crossed her arms, a formidable barrier of toned muscle and expensive athleisure wear. "I'm busy," she said, her voice flat. "This will just take a moment," Leo said, slowing his pace as he approached, keeping a non-threatening distance. "I just wanted to let you know, it looks like one of your sprinklers is on the fritz. It's watering my driveway more than your lawn. Don't want you to get a letter from the HOA about water waste." He'd framed it as if he were doing her a favor, a tactic he hoped would disarm her. It seemed to work, slightly. She glanced over at the offending sprinkler head, her lips tightening in annoyance. "Fine. I'll have my landscaper look at it," she said, clearly intending for the conversation to be over. She turned to go. "Great, thanks," Leo said quickly. "Oh, hey, while I have you—" She stopped, turning back with an impatient sigh. "What is it?" Leo took the plunge. "I've been having some trouble with my EV charger since that weekend you had your issue." He let the phrase hang there, deliberately vague. "It's been throwing some weird fault codes. I had to call the manufacturer's tech support, and they think the power control module might be failing." This got her attention. He could see a flicker of vindicated smugness in her eyes. "I told you so. They asked me a few questions to diagnose it," Leo continued, his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "And I was hoping you could help me out. They wanted to know if any other car models have been using the charger recently. Just trying to rule out a software compatibility bug, you know?" He paused, letting her walk into it. He watched her face, the micro-expressions that told the whole story. She saw an opportunity, not a trap. An opportunity to be proven right, to reinforce her narrative that the fault was his, not hers. "Of course other cars have been using it," she scoffed, the words dripping with condescension. "I've used it, and I told you from the beginning. Your machine is a piece of junk. It barely charged my Porsche the last couple of times I plugged in. You're lucky it didn't do permanent damage to my battery systems. I should have sent you the bill for the diagnostic I had the dealership run." Leo's mind reeled. It was more than he could have hoped for. A direct admission, a confirmation of multiple uses, a fresh threat. It was all there, being captured in pristine 4K video and high-fidelity audio. He had to fight to keep the triumphant grin off his face. Right. I remember you mentioning that," he said, nodding sympathetically. "So you're saying it wasn't charging at full speed for you either?" "That's really helpful, actually. That's the same thing I've been seeing." "It wasn't charging at any speed," she snapped. "It was pathetic. Honestly, I don't know why you'd install such a low-end unit on a new house." He had it. He had everything he needed. He could walk away now, mission accomplished. But the part of him that she had belittled and bullied, the part of him that had been shaking with rage on her doorstep, wanted to twist the knife. Just a little. "Okay, thank you. This is perfect for my records with the manufacturer," he said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly, becoming more precise, more clinical. "So just to be absolutely clear for my report, you are confirming that you used my charger on the night of Friday, August 29th, and then again on the night of Friday, September 5th. He watched her face as he said the dates. It was like watching a series of geological shifts happen in seconds. The smug arrogance was the first layer to crumble, washed away by a flash flood of confusion. The confusion then hardened into sharp, sudden suspicion. Her eyes, which had been dismissive, narrowed into accusatory slits. The specific dates were wrong. They were too specific. How could he possibly know the exact dates unless— Her gaze dropped from his eyes down the front of his shirt. For a split second, it swept over the camera lens, not registering. Then her eyes snapped back to it. He saw the moment of recognition, the tiny dark circle that wasn't a shadow, the subtle glint of glass that wasn't a stray thread. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the dawning horror in her eyes, the sickening realization that her own words had just been weaponized against her. She had not only walked into the trap, she had armed it herself. Are you recording me?" she stammered, the words catching in her throat. Her voice was a choked whisper, all the previous bravado gone, replaced by the raw panic of being caught. Leo didn't answer. He just gave her a small, cold smile. That was answer enough. The panic in her eyes instantly vaporized, replaced by a pure, primal rage. The mask of civilized suburbia didn't just slip, it was violently torn away. "You sick bastard!" she shrieked, the sound tearing through the Saturday morning peace. "You can't do that! That's illegal!" She lunged at him. It wasn't a clumsy push or a slap. It was a full-body tackle, driven by adrenaline and fury. Her hands clawed at his shirt, fingers digging in, trying to rip the camera off his chest. Leo, caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the attack, stumbled backward, his arms coming up to shield his face. He tripped over the edge of the lawn, his balance gone. He fell hard onto the grass, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Catherine was on top of him in an instant, a snarling, spitting incarnation of fury. She was screaming, a torrent of incoherent threats and curses, her manicured nails scratching at his arms and neck as she tore at his shirt. The world was a chaotic blur of green grass, blue sky, and her contorted, raging face. Through the chaos, he was vaguely aware of the small, heroic body camera, now pointing erratically at the sky, then her face, then the ground, still dutifully recording every frantic second, every screamed threat, every bit of the assault. The digital trap had become brutally, violently physical. The world resolved into a series of fractured, violent images for Leo. The crazed look in Catherine's eyes, inches from his own. The flash of her rings as her hands clawed at his chest. The suffocating pressure of her weight on him. His own. Gasping breaths. He wasn't fighting back. He was simply enduring, his arms wrapped around his head in a primal defensive instinct. The tiny camera on his ruined shirt was the only part of him still on the offensive, its unblinking eye capturing the raw, ugly truth of the attack. "What the hell is going on?" A man's voice, laced with panic, cut through Catherine's enraged. Screaming. Suddenly the weight was gone. Leo felt hands grabbing Catherine, pulling her off him. He scrambled backward on the grass, crab-walking away, his lungs heaving. He looked up to see Catherine's husband, Mark, wrestling with his wife, his face pale with horror. "Catherine, stop it! Get a grip! What are you doing?" Mark yelled, struggling to hold her as she thrashed like a wild animal. "He recorded me, Mark! He was recording me!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, blood-tipped finger at Leo. One of her perfectly manicured nails was broken, a tiny, insignificant casualty in the wreckage of the morning. The suburban tableau was shattered. Across the street, Mr. Henderson, a retiree who spent his days meticulously polishing his classic car, was standing frozen in his driveway, hose still in hand. 2 doors down, a woman Leo didn't know was peering through her blinds, phone held up to her window. The quiet, manicured peace of their cul-de-sac had been violated, and everyone was a spectator. Leo slowly, painfully, got to his feet. His neck and arms stung with angry red scratches. His polo shirt was torn open at the collar. He reached up with a trembling hand and touched the camera. It was still there, its small blue indicator light blinking steadily. It had survived. He had survived. "You're going to jail, you sicko!" Catherine screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria as Mark finally managed to drag her back a few feet onto her own lawn. "Assaulting a woman! I'll have you locked up for years." Mark looked at Leo, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. "Look, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," he stammered, his words tumbling over each other. A neighborly dispute that got out of hand. "We don't need to get anyone else involved, right? We can sort this out." It was the classic enabler's prayer, the desperate hope that the consequences of his wife's monstrous behavior could be contained, negotiated away, swept back under the rug. But the sound of an approaching siren answered his question for him. Someone else had already gotten involved. 2 police cruisers swung onto the street, their arrival sucking all the remaining normalcy out of the air. Neighbors who had been peeking from their windows now came out onto their porches. The private drama had become a public spectacle. 2 officers emerged, a man and a woman, their expressions calm but authoritative. They took in the scene in an instant. Catherine, hysterical and disheveled, being restrained by her husband. Leo standing alone, clothes torn and bleeding from several scratches. "All right, what's going on here?" the male officer asked, his voice a solid block of calm in the swirling chaos. Catherine immediately launched her preemptive strike. "Thank God you're here, officer," she cried, tears streaming down her face now, a performance of pure victimhood. "This man, my neighbor, he assaulted me. He came onto my property, he was harassing me, he had a camera, he was filming me, I was terrified. I had to defend myself." The officer looked from her Oscar-worthy performance to Leo's stoic, bleeding figure. "Sir, what's your side of the story?" the female officer asked, approaching him. Leo took a deep breath, marshaling his thoughts, forcing the adrenaline back into its cage. His voice when he spoke was unnervingly steady. "My name is Leo Garrison. That woman," he said, pointing a steady finger at Catherine, "just assaulted me on my property." "He's lying!" Catherine shrieked. "I have a witness. Mark, tell them! Tell them he was harassing me!" Mark looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming train, trapped between the loyalty he owed his wife and the blatant, undeniable facts. "It was a disagreement," he mumbled weakly. "It all happened so fast." "Sir," the male officer said to Leo, his tone hardening slightly under the force of Catherine's accusations. "Did you record this woman?" "Yes," Leo said simply. A wave of vindication washed over Catherine's face. See? He admits it. The pervert." "And why were you recording her?" the officer asked, his hand drifting toward his notepad. "Because, for the past month, she has been repeatedly stealing electricity from my home to charge her electric vehicle," Leo stated, the words clear and precise. "I have digital logs of the thefts. After a verbal confrontation failed, I set up a system to document any further theft. This morning, I initiated a conversation with Ms. Calloway about a separate matter during which I was wearing a body camera for my own protection. On that camera, I have recorded her admitting to the thefts. When she realized she was being recorded, she physically attacked me in an attempt to destroy the evidence." He delivered the statement with the dispassionate clarity of a technician reading a diagnostic report. The officers exchanged a look. Catherine's narrative was loud and emotional. Leo's was detailed, technical, and chillingly specific. "That's insane." "He's making it all up," Catherine yelled, but a new note of desperation had crept into her voice. The mention of logs and a recorded confession had clearly unnerved her. "Sir, do you still have this recording?" the female officer asked. "Leo." "Yes, I do," Leo said. He carefully reached up, unclipped the small black rectangle from his shredded shirt, and held it out. "The entire incident is on here. The conversation, her admission, and the unprovoked assault. You'll find the video is comprehensive." The male officer took the camera from him. "Stay here," he said, then walked back to his cruiser. The female officer stood between Leo's property and Catherine's, a human dividing line. Catherine had fallen silent, her eyes fixated on the police car, on the officer who was now plugging the small device into a laptop mounted on the dashboard. The next 5 minutes were the longest of Leo's life. He stood on his lawn, aware of the scratches on his skin, the torn fabric of his shirt, the curious eyes of his neighbors. Catherine stood on hers, her husband's hand on her arm, her face a mask of disbelief, as if she simply couldn't process a world in which her version of events wasn't immediately accepted as gospel. She had always been able to bulldoze her way through life with sheer force of will and entitlement. She was watching that reality crumble in real time. Finally, the door of the police cruiser opened. The officer stepped out. His walk was different now, slower, more deliberate. He didn't look at Leo. He didn't look at Catherine's husband. His eyes were locked directly on Catherine. He walked past the female officer, his face unreadable but set like stone. He stopped a few feet in front of her. Catherine, seeing him approach, seemed to regain some of her bluster. "Well," she demanded, "are you going to arrest him or what?" The officer stared at her for a long, silent moment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "please turn around and place your hands behind your back." The words hit the air with the force of a physical impact. Catherine froze, her mouth agape. Her husband's hand dropped from her arm as if it had been burned. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you say?" "You are under arrest for assault and battery," the officer stated, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "No!" Catherine screamed, the sound raw and animalistic as she stumbled backward. "No, you can't! He's the one who attacked me! Mark, do something!" But Mark was paralyzed, his face ashen. He could offer no help. The video had spoken, and it had told a truth so undeniable that it had rendered all their lies obsolete. The officer was not asking. He stepped forward, took her arm in a firm grip, and spun her around. The sharp, metallic click-click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed across the silent cul-de-sac. Leo stood by his porch and watched. He felt no joy, no triumph. Just the profound, hollow ache of a battle he never wanted to fight, but had been forced to win. The trap he had so meticulously designed had sprung. The consequences he had set in motion had arrived. The entitled woman, who believed she was above the rules, was now ensnared by them, the clicking of the handcuffs a final damning verdict. As the police cruiser turned the corner, taking Catherine Calloway out of his life in a silent flash of red and blue lights, a profound and unsettling quiet descended upon the cul-de-sac. The impromptu audience of neighbors, having witnessed the final shocking act of the drama, retreated back into the sanctity of their homes, closing doors and drawing blinds. The spectacle was over. All that remained was the aftermath. Mark stood alone on his perfect lawn, a statue of impotent misery. He looked at the empty space where the cruiser had been, then his gaze drifted across the grass to Leo. His face was a wreck of conflicting emotions, shame, exhaustion, a flicker of anger, but mostly a deep, soul-crushing defeat. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it. There was nothing to say. He turned and walked back into his house, the click of his front door sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. Leo stood there for a long time, the adrenaline slowly draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. He looked down at his torn shirt, at the angry red welts on his arms. He felt a dull ache in his back from the fall. He had won. He had set a trap, and the target had not only walked into it, but had then proceeded to detonate it on herself in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Yet there was no feeling of triumph. Only the grim, weary satisfaction of a problem that had been solved at great and unpleasant cost. The legal process that followed was exactly what he expected. a slow, grinding machine of bureaucracy. The assault and battery charge was open and shut. The video evidence was so absolute, so damning, that Catherine's high-priced lawyer couldn't even attempt to spin it. But Leo didn't stop there. He met with the prosecutor from the district attorney's office, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, and laid out the entire story. He presented his case file, the time-stamped charging logs from Operation Entitlement, the hardware IDs captured from the Porsche, the separate security camera videos of Catherine plugging her car in on multiple occasions, and finally, the body camera footage with her verbal admission. The prosecutor watched him with a growing sense of astonishment. "Mr. Garrison," she said, looking up from the neatly organized files he'd provided on a USB stick. "In my 12 years on this job, I have never seen a civilian present a case this thoroughly documented. This is the kind of evidence we dream of." She added 2 counts of petty theft and 1 count of theft of utilities to the complaint. "It wasn't about the dollar amount of the electricity," she explained. "It was about the pattern, the deliberation, the intent. His meticulous logs had turned a minor squabble into an undeniable criminal enterprise. A week before the first scheduled court date, Mark appeared on his doorstep. He looked older, diminished. There were dark circles under his eyes. "Garrison, Leo," he began, his voice raspy. "Can we talk?" Leo didn't invite him in. He stood in the doorway, a neutral expression on his face. "What do you want, Mark?" "My wife, Catherine. She's not herself. She's a wreck," he pleaded. "Look, I know what she did was wrong. Both the electricity thing and what happened on your lawn. There's no excuse, but a criminal record will ruin her charity work, her reputation. It will all be gone. Actions have consequences," Leo said, his voice flat. I know, Mark said, his hands fluttering nervously. "But let me make it right. I'll pay for the electricity, all of it, 10 times what she took. I'll pay for your medical bills, for your clothes, for your trouble. Name a number, any number. Just talk to the DA. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Ask them to drop the charges. Please." It was the moment Leo had been waiting for, though he hadn't realized it until now. The final test. They still thought it was about money. They still believed that any problem, any transgression, could be erased with a checkbook. They hadn't understood the fundamental principle of the conflict. "This was never about the money, Mark," Leo said, his voice quiet but firm. "It was about respect. It was about the simple, basic decency of asking before you take something that doesn't belong to you. Your wife doesn't believe that rule applies to her. She believes her wants are more important than my rights. If I take your money and let this go away, what lesson is learned? That she was right all along. That for the right price, she can do whatever she wants." He looked Mark directly in the eye. "I'm not dropping anything. She needs to stand in a courtroom and answer for what she did. That's the only payment I'm interested in." Defeated, Mark simply nodded and walked away. Faced with an avalanche of irrefutable evidence, Catherine Calloway took a plea deal. She pled guilty to 1 count of misdemeanor assault and 2 counts of petty theft. The judge, after reviewing the body camera footage in his chambers, was not lenient. The sentence was a masterpiece of karmic justice. There was no jail time, but the penalties were designed to strike at the very heart of Catherine's ego. She was fined $10,000. She was ordered to pay restitution to Leo for the electricity, a precisely calculated sum of $87.43. She was mandated to attend a 52-week anger management program. And the final, crushing blow, she was sentenced to 200 hours of community service, specifically with the city's sanitation department. 2 months later, Leo was driving home from work when he saw it. A crew in bright orange vests was picking up trash along the median of the main boulevard, and there, among them, was Catherine. Her lustrous blonde hair was hidden under a baseball cap. Her designer athletic wear had been replaced with a standard issue, safety vest over a cheap t-shirt. She was wearing thick work gloves and holding a long-handled trash picker, miserably plucking discarded fast food wrappers and cigarette butts from the grass. She looked up as the traffic slowed, and for a brief moment, her eyes met Leo's through his windshield. He saw no remorse in them, only a flat, bottomless well of hatred. She knew exactly who he was, and she knew that he had put her there. He didn't smile or gloat. He simply met her gaze, gave a slow, deliberate nod, and drove on. That evening, a for sale sign appeared on the Callaways' lawn. It was the large, ostentatious kind with a glossy, airbrushed photo of Mark and Catherine smiling their perfect false smiles. The humiliation of her public sentence was too much. The neighborhood was now tainted. They were leaving. A few weeks after that, on a cool autumn evening, Leo stood in his driveway. The moving trucks were gone. The house next door was dark and empty. A gentle peace had settled back over the cul-de-sac. He pulled the charging cable from its holster and plugged it into his Mustang. The familiar green light began to pulse, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the gathering twilight. He looked at the small, unassuming black box on his wall. It had been the catalyst for so much chaos, so much anger. But it had also been his instrument of justice. It hadn't been an act of vengeance. It had been an act of restoration, of rebalancing an equation that had been thrown wildly out of sync by one person's boundless entitlement. He hadn't started the war, but he had ended it, using the very logic and order that his antagonist so thoroughly disdained. He felt no lingering anger, no satisfying thrill of victory. All he felt was a quiet, profound sense of peace. The system was back in balance. His home was his own again. And as he went inside, the charger on the wall continued its work, its steady green light a silent, watchful sentinel in the quiet of the night.